as it is. So I am Dr. Justine, and I will be facilitating this webinar today with respect to the Center for Organization Leadership and Development, and our discussion being on the issue of innovation in teaching and assessment towards inquiry-based higher education learning practices. So we will enter into conversations regarding this particular topic, and primarily we focus on advancing the field of organization development. So today's webinar focuses on innovation in teaching and assessment towards inquiry-based higher education learning practices. And the bottom line, as I have posted during part of my social media platforms, is the understanding that we are faced with a society in motion. And since we are faced with a society in motion, we have to adopt certain innovative practices to education, certain innovative practices to teaching and assessment. So just as a brief highlight of what we do as the Center for Organization Leadership and Development, we offer professional certification programs in organization leadership and development, and we also offer the Director Development Certified Program. We also do offer the customized professional development learning and the talent management certification program. The Center for Organization Leadership and Development also works with the Chartered Institute of Leadership and Governance, where we are working on a model to deliver their programs in leadership and governance. We also do publish the Organization Leadership and Development Quarterly, or the OLDQ, where we seek to ignite insightful conversations in the field of organization leadership and organization development. So feel free to get in touch with us for conversations relating to the programs that we offer, the continuing professional development programs that we offer as the Center for Organization Leadership and Development. And again, I am Dr. Justine Chinoperekweyi, the Director of Academics and Programs at the Center for Organization Leadership and Development. I also work as the Academic Director here in Abu Dhabi and visiting faculty in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. But my primary focus is on organization development, organization leadership. I also am engaged in discussions relating to scholarship, research work in scholarship, and I do some keynote programs as well in the fields of corporate governance, organization development, leadership, and engaged scholarship. So today's webinar on innovation in teaching and assessment, the question that we might have is, why this webinar? Why is it important to enter into conversations regarding innovation in teaching, innovation in assessment? And as I discuss, or as we engage in these conversations, I just learned that the African Union did launch its handbook on innovation in education. And it's the appropriate time, perhaps, to discuss this particular subject and explore different aspects of innovations. And we are going to look at innovations in education not from the general perspective or the usual discussions in terms of retooling, but the fundamental aspects of innovation in teaching and innovation in assessment. So we are going to look at cultivating the innovativeness impulse within academic institutions. We will also explore teaching conceptions, and we will also have discussions with respect to what is innovation in education versus educational innovation, and also a discussion on the different transformations that have been recorded in innovation in that respect. So this is, in a nutshell, some of the areas that we are going to cover in the next 1 hour in the context of innovations in education. And just to make sure that we are all on board, I will just check our chat box in order to see the discussions that are going on. And if anyone wants to be part of our discussions, feel free to contact us through the chat box, and you can send any questions, any comments regarding this particular webinar through the chat box in that respect. And should you require any clarifications with respect to this particular discussion, feel free to engage with us in the chat box, and let's have discussions in that context. So I'll just take one minute to ensure that we are all on board as we get some messages in people who are trying to connect with us. So just 1 minute, and then we will proceed with this particular discussion in terms of innovations in education towards an inquiry-based teaching and learning practices. Okay, welcome back, and we will proceed with this particular discussion. So in order to set the contextual review of this particular discussion, these are some of the areas that we are going to be discussing during this webinar. But it is important to understand that this webinar is generally informed by the numerous calls by academic enterprises, by different researchers and scholars for the need to have inquiry-based teaching and learning in higher education, and the need for higher education institutions to develop critical thinkers, the need for higher education institutions to develop problem solvers, and to develop learners who actually transcend the mere acquisition of knowledge to actually the application of knowledge. So when we are moving away from the traditional teaching and learning practices, which focuses on the mere cultivation of capacity and efficiency, towards an inquiry-based practice which looks at developing learners and learners in total, we need to have certain innovations being adopted in that respect. So in developing this webinar, I noted that most scholars do concur that inquiry-based teaching, inquiry-based assessment has the capacity to transform learning at higher education. And as such, this webinar therefore seeks to explore innovations that should support higher education teaching and assessment. What are some of the innovations that should be adopted in order to make teaching and assessment instruments of help? So in contextual review, we're going to have this discussion in the context of higher education learners, looking at the characteristics of higher education learners, and also reviewing the functions of higher education. And then we will explore the inquiry-based educational practices and teaching conceptions, and also the issue of appreciative inquiry and the different transformations in education. The bottom line being our understanding that teaching and assessment must be extremely sensitive to the whole movement of life. So this webinar is informed by that understanding. It is informed by our belief, our strong belief that inquiry-based teaching and assessment has the capacity to transform higher education. It has the capacity to enhance the value of higher education. And as such, we need to adopt certain innovations in line with the transformations that are happening in education in that respect. So the main point is that those who are engaged in teaching and assessment need to fundamentally shift their theoretical perspectives or analytical orthodox regarding teaching and assessment. And it brings back the need to adopt certain innovations in education. So if we look at the news platforms or the media as it is, there are a lot of reports about innovations in education. And in most instances, these reports or these submissions look at innovation from the point of view of the tools, the techniques that we can actually use, the tangibles that can be used in education. But this particular webinar is going to look at innovation from a different perspective, though importantly needed in order to complement the retooling aspects of innovation. So the focus of this webinar, or our submission as the Center for Organization, Leadership and Development, is with respect to innovations in line with shifting the theoretical perspectives, shifting the analytical orthodoxy or the theoretical lenses of those who are engaged in higher education in that respect. So it is important for those engaged in higher education to adopt certain practices or innovations that support the growth of higher educational institutions and that ensure that we make teaching and assessment instruments of help. So when we look at the major innovations in education, basically we have innovations with respect to the digital textbooks, innovations with respect to social media, gamification, remote learning. These are some of the major innovations that we see in education today. But this webinar seeks to discuss the non-tech-based innovations, the non-tech-based methodologies that can enhance the performance of learning organizations. What are some of those non-tech innovations that we need to adopt in contemporary classrooms in order to ensure teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help? And this is the bottom line with respect to the discussion that we have in this particular webinar. So the main question that we need to engage in conversations during and after this webinar is that what are some of the fundamental innovations required to ensure teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help within higher education? There are certain innovations, fundamental innovations, that educational institutions, particularly those at higher education level, need to adopt in order to ensure teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help within higher education. So in the chat box, if we can give some responses to this particular question. And we are focusing on non-tech innovations, non-technology innovations that need to be adopted in modern day classrooms in order to ensure that teaching and assessment do become instruments of help within our learning institutions. So we also understand that we are faced with a society in motion, and innovation in higher education teaching and assessment is essential to systematic progression and development. If we do not innovate in the approaches or the ways we conduct teaching and assessment will not become instruments of help. It will be extremely difficult to achieve the objectives of higher education. So we look at a society that we are in, a society in motion, and we have the aspects of retooling, which is discussed in most instances. But we are submitting through this webinar that besides the issues of retooling our classrooms, besides the certain tools, tangible aspects of technology, there are certain fundamental innovations that we need to put in place in order to ensure teaching and assessment become instruments of help. And it is important to note that learners today, especially the learners at higher education level, they require teaching and assessment that is premised on acute observation, clear perception, and intelligent observation. So there's the issue of clarity of perception in those who are teaching, intelligent observation by educators, and also acute care. So there are certain innovations that are required which will not be addressed through the tangible aspects of technology in the classrooms. The issue of acute care, we need to be innovative in the classroom to demonstrate acute care, intelligent observation, and the clarity of perception. So what do we need? What should faculty members, what should teachers or mentors do in order to innovate at the more fundamental level to such an extent that learning is enhanced even in the absence of certain tools? Because we have certain societies that will not be able to achieve or acquire the required tools for the classrooms, say in the next 5 years. But the learners themselves have to derive value from the teaching activity. And what then do we need to do? What are some of those fundamental innovations that are required to ensure teaching and assessment do become instruments of help within higher education enterprises or even at other levels of education? We see a lot of training and development institutions. We see a lot of programs that are being offered by these training and development institutions. The question is, are these programs or the way we deliver these programs becoming instruments of help to move our societies forward in that respect? So we are faced with this society in motion, and as learning organizations or academic institutions, there is need to innovate in ways that will make teaching and assessment to become instruments of help. So educating learners requires clear perception, it requires intelligent observation, and it requires acute care. So faculty members, teachers, mentors need to innovate, need to be creative in the way that they handle contemporary classrooms, today's classrooms, to demonstrate these qualities. And we need to understand that understanding a learner requires us to watch this learner play we have to study him in different moods without imposing upon him our own prejudices, hopes, or fears, without us trying to mold the learner to fit a certain pattern of our desires. And this is one dilemma that we see in most academic institutions. Faculty members and teachers, they need to mold learners to fit a certain pattern. We try to mold learners to fit our desires, our idiosyncrasies, and our vanities. And the submission that we're making through this webinar is to say that we need to innovate different approaches or different ways to teaching and assessment in order to ensure that teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help. So most of us desire to shape the child, the learner, the student, in a way that is gratifying to our own vanities and our own idiosyncrasies. And we find varying degrees of comfort and satisfaction in exclusive ownership and domination. And in the end, it affects the entire learning process. Learners are not then in a position to demonstrate their creative abilities. Learners fail to then discover themselves through the learning activities. So innovations in education, in the context of the non-tech innovations, require us to have clarity of perception, intelligent observation, and acute care in order to develop learners. So to educate our children, to educate learners, we must be sensitive to the whole movement of life and understanding that we are faced with a society in motion. So we need to look at what we think, what we do, what we say matters infinitely, because it creates the environment, and the environment either helps or hinders the learner. So when we're submitting that we need inquiry-based learning, inquiry-based teaching and assessment through certain innovations, it is through the understanding that educating a learner is a complex endeavor. And most of the learners, I will discuss the characteristics of these learners. Most of these learners, yes, they are curious, but they are also impressionable. We have these learners who are also volatile and so sensitive. And as such, we need to be innovative in our approaches to teaching, in our approaches to assessment in that respect. So I'll check our chat box for any comments, for any discussions regarding this particular webinar. Please feel free to engage with us in conversations that are fundamental to us understanding this particular discussion on innovations in education towards inquiry-based teaching and assessment practices. So we need to understand that most learners are curious. They really want to learn. And this is one defining characteristic of millennials. But it seems their eager inquiry is dulled by educators' pontifical assertions, superior impatience, and the casual brushing aside of that curiosity. So when we say we need innovations in teaching and assessment from a non-tech perspective, we need to do away with these pontifical assertions where the teacher has this exclusive focus, that domination in the classroom that we see from the traditional teaching approach. That superior impatience. We need to do away with the casual brushing aside of learners' curiosity. And this requires fundamental innovations. And this will not be addressed by the tech innovation, the technology innovations. There's so much discussions that we are having regarding the fourth industrial revolutions and trying to have classes that are designed in a certain format, these designs will not help us in developing learners who are creative, learners who are problem solvers, learners who are entrepreneurial. Yet when we fail to address fundamental issues, when we fail to innovate at the most fundamental level. So innovation in teaching and assessment is fundamental to awaken and sustain learners' critical alertness and keen insight. So we need to innovate. We need to find non-tech approaches, non-tech methods to ensure that we awaken and sustain learners' critical alertness and keen insight. And these innovations are important because they complement the tech innovations that we focus on in most of our discussions. So innovations in teaching, innovations in assessment seek to ensure that we sustain eager inquiry among learners and we nurture curiosity among learners, hence developing that critical alertness and that keen insight. And this does not require much of the technology in the way we design our classrooms, but it requires fundamental, at the most basic level, innovations in our teaching and assessment practices. So what is innovation and what is education? We are talking about innovation in education, but what do we mean by innovation and what do we mean by education? Because that understanding helps us in developing clarity of conception with regards to the dimension of innovations in education. And this is what this webinar seeks to ignite, that particular conversation that says we need to have fundamental innovations in teaching, we need to have fundamental innovations in assessment, looking at the whole aspect of scholarship. There should be some fundamental innovations that should be developed by the learning institutions or the academic institutions in that respect. So we need to understand that it is our direct responsibility to bring about new approaches to education. In as much as we see a lot of technology, movements in technology, developments in technology, faculty members or teachers or those within academic institutions need to recognize that it is their responsibility, it is our responsibility to bring about new approaches to education. And teaching is not a specialist profession. Most of us are washed out by slavery to routine, through compliance, through fear and acceptance, to such an extent that we are finished. We are in the prison of conditioning. We are in the prison of conformity. We are in the prison of compulsion, where we have to do things in a certain way. The culture of doing things has influenced our way of thinking. We are in that slavery of routine. But it is essential that we get into conversations that say it is our responsibility to bring about new approaches to scholarship. It is our responsibility to bring about new approaches to education. And teaching should not be a matter of routine, but experiencing and nurturing the creative impulse that makes teaching an instrument of help. So when we are saying we have a responsibility to bring about new approaches, the bottom line is we need to innovate in ways that will nurture the creative impulse that makes teaching and assessment instruments of help. So we have this particular question which we need to get into conversation during or after this particular webinar. And the question is, what can be done to cultivate the creative impulse of innovation in education at individual and at institutional levels, because we are washed out by that slavery of routine. What are some of the interventions? What can be done to cultivate the creative impulse for innovation in education at individual and institutional level? And these are some of the questions. I've highlighted two more questions before. These are some of the questions that we need to engage in conversations in our institutions as we try to complement the technology-based innovations. Because we see certain institutions, they have all the state-of-the-art instruments for them to design their classrooms. Their learning spaces are designed in line with the evidence-based findings that we get in designing of learning spaces in academic institutions. But we are not achieving the fundamental objectives of higher education. They fail to achieve the fundamental goals of education. So we need to complement these learning spaces, the design of learning spaces, with certain fundamental innovations, bringing out new approaches to innovation and ensuring that teaching and assessment will then become instruments of help within our institutions. So we need to appreciate that stagnant universities are expensive and ineffectual monuments to a status quo, which is most likely to be a status quo ante yesterday's world preserved in a speak. So when we're talking of innovations in teaching and assessment, we need to relook at the demands of teaching and assessment. And the demands include pedagogy premised on clear perception, intelligent observation, and acute care. We need teaching and assessment that shakes or avoids imposing educators' own prejudices, hopes, and fears. We also need teaching and assessment that is sensitive to the whole movement of life. We need pedagogy premised on experiencing and nurturing the creative impulse of learners. Finally, we need integrative teaching and assessment which is supported with great insight and the strength of patience and love. So as academic institutions, as we endeavor to align with the developments in the technological environment, we need to come down to the fundamental innovations that complement the technological innovations that we might have in designing our learning spaces. And we submit through this webinar that this can be done through engaging in inquiry-based practices. Because through inquiry-based practices, we will manage to produce critical thinkers. We will be able to awaken and sustain critical alertness and keen insight among learners. So there is a difference between innovation in education versus educational innovation, and these are some of the aspects that we need to be aware of. In terms of innovation in education, it involves the broader context of innovation, where we look at educational innovation, scientific and technological innovations, the infrastructural, economic, social, legal, and administrative innovations. But when we look at educational innovation, it encompasses the procedure or methods of educational activities that differ significantly from established practice and is used to increase the level of efficiency in a competitive environment. So educational innovations looks at pedagogical innovation, scientific and methodological innovation. We also look at educational and technological innovations. So we need to create a balance as we design our learning spaces and bringing in some of these fundamental innovations in education and also the pedagogical innovations that are essential to make education instruments of health. So we need to revisit the functions of higher education. And according to Vardat 2009, he indicated that the meaning of higher education cannot be found in the content of teaching and research. It is not found in pedagogical practices, nor is it found in admission policies. In most instances, when we are defining the functions of higher education, we tend to focus on the content of teaching and research. We also tend to focus on the pedagogical practices or the admission policies. But it is important to understand that the meaning of higher education goes beyond these three elements. And the three purposes of higher education includes the production of knowledge, it includes the dissemination of that knowledge, and it also includes community engagement. So when we are looking at the innovations in teaching, innovations in assessment, we need to relook at the functions of higher education and the purposes of higher education, and then integrate that with these fundamental innovations that we believe are essential in developing learners in that respect. So instead of the current focus on certification and accumulation of information, this is what most educational institutions are focusing on today: the accumulation of knowledge, filling learners' knowledge containers. We need to stretch our functions of education beyond the mere accumulation of knowledge to actually bring about an integrated individual and create new values. So the function of higher education includes bringing about an integrated individual and creating new values. So when learners come to our educational institutions as freshers, as first years, and we take them through a 4-year program, a bachelor's program, until the 4th year, at the end, when these learners are graduating, we need to have an integrated individual. We need to have someone who can create new values. And this can only happen if we adopt certain innovations which are way beyond the technology aspects that we can focus on. The design of learning spaces will not help us to develop that integrated human being. Learning spaces alone will not help us to create new values. But there are certain fundamental innovations that we need to embed in our curriculums in order to ensure that we develop teaching and assessment to become instruments of help. So teaching and assessment at higher education must nurture creativity. It must generate the capacity for independent and critical thinking. And this requires innovations in the way we deliver our classrooms, in the way we assess learners' work in the classroom. So learners in higher education must be equipped with confidence. They must be equipped with the aptitude and skills they need for life and for work. So this is re-examining the functions of higher education and trying to develop innovations that will make exercise, the learning exercise, an instrument of help. So the development of learners' intellectual and imaginative powers, their understanding and judgment, their problem-solving skills, their ability to communicate, their ability to see relationships within what they have learned, and to perceive their field of study in a broader perspective. higher education must aim to stimulate an inquiring, analytical, and creative approach, encouraging independent judgment and critical self-assessment. And this quote is from the now defunct UK Council for National Academic Awards. And it covers the broader perspective of higher education. And I need us to take moments of reflection in terms of our previous engagements, either as faculty members or as learners. Was the learning process developing intellectual and imaginative powers? When we are teaching, are we developing intellectual and imaginative powers? Or we are just imposing and filling learners as knowledge containers? When we reflect on our learning practices, teaching and assessment, was this helping in terms of enhancing understanding and judgment, problem solving and ability to communicate, ability to see relationships within what we have learned? So we need to have a way of reflection and think through the way we engage in teaching and assessment, and then say, what are some of the innovations that are required in order to make higher education a mode or a process of developing learners' intellectual and imaginative powers? What are some of the innovations that we require in the classrooms or at institutional level in order to enhance the ability of learners to communicate? What are some of the innovations that are required in the classrooms and at institutional level in order to enhance understanding and judgment among learners? What are some of the fundamental innovations that we require at institutional level or as a faculty member in order to stimulate an inquiry, analytical, and creative approach? We need certain innovations in order to encourage independent judgment and critical self-assessment. So we need to reflect on this and see the function of higher education as a way of molding and cultivating learners, bringing about an integrated individual, creating new values, facilitating socialization, and modifying behaviors. And there is need for our academic institutions or institutions of higher learning to prioritize, in as much as we are prioritizing and developing plans for the redesign of our learning spaces, we need to have plans to look at the most basic aspects of delivering or approaches to teaching and assessment, and innovating ways that will mold and cultivate learners to become integrated individuals and to create new values. Because as long as education is based on cut and dried principles, it can turn out men and women who are efficient, but it cannot produce creative human beings. And I believe this is the disconnect between our understanding of scholarship today and the way we are delivering scholarship. Because we see organizations crying out as a result of the illiquidity in the market, talent illiquidity in the market. But we as academic institutions, we are churning out graduates year in, year out. But are these individuals creative human beings? How can we get to bridge that gap of illiquidity within the talent market and the way that we are delivering? There is a lot of academic instrumentalism that is ruining potential, putting down the eager inquiry in learners. So there is need for most academic institutions to innovate approaches to teaching and assessment that will develop learners and learners in total. We need to produce not efficient men and women. We need to produce not erudites or people who can recite and memorize certain concepts, but rather we need creative human beings. And this can be achieved if we re-examine, we rethink the functions of education, and we innovate approaches to complement the technological innovations that we are always discussing in most of our strategic plans. So as a way of reflection, we need to reflect on our previous learning experiences and share with us either through the chat box, or you can message us after this webinar in order to engage in conversations. We at the Center for Organization, Leadership and Development, we strongly believe in dialogic conversations, or rather we believe in the organization development values, and we welcome conversations that are aimed at developing the different areas. It could be at individual, at team, at organizational, or at societal level. So as we do reflections with regards to this particular subject of innovations in education towards an inquiry-based teaching and assessment practices, we need to relook and rethink some of the ways that can be used in order to enhance learning activities in and outside of the classroom. So there are different characteristics of learners, today's learners, which we term the millennials. They are considered to be thoughtful, they are open-minded, they have access to more information platforms, they prefer direct interactions, they are realistic problem solvers, information hungry, social media savvy, they are adventurous with short attention spans, they prefer facilitated learning, and they are also exposed to logic-based and experiential learning. And as a result of these characteristics, we need to move away from traditional teaching approaches to actually engage in some innovative teaching and assessment approaches. And some of the strategies that can be used to engage learners include research-based methods. There is the issue of relevance in terms of our curriculum or the material that we teach in the classrooms, the rationale, and a relaxed environment which can come with our redesigning the learning spaces, and also building rapport with between the learner and the faculty members. So an understanding of the characteristics of learners in today's learning environment will help us to develop innovations that will make teaching and assessment instruments of help. And as a way of reflection, again, we need to have a reflection on what are some of the most innovative things that you as a faculty member have done. It could be in the classroom, or when you're doing some of the professional development activities. What are some of the innovations that you have brought to the classrooms? We would want to engage in conversations regarding this particular question as well, and develop some of the innovations that are fundamental to enhancing teaching and assessment within higher education institutions. So feel free to share with us some of the innovative things that you have done or have seen other faculty members do in the classrooms. And there are certain conditions that are required for us to be able to nurture creativity and innovations at institutional or even at individual levels. And we need to build our self-confidence. There is need for critical thinking, collaborative engagement, and multidisciplinary and multi-tasked work teams. In my previous discussion webinar on organization development, theory, practice, and values, I did spoke about the issues of task forces and radical circles. So in order to nurture creativity and innovation in our classrooms, we need to develop some of these competencies and capabilities in that respect. And it is essential at individual level to also reflect on through conducting a force field analysis in order to identify the conditions that are relevant. I conducted this particular exercise with one school in order to understand the conditions necessary to nurture creativity and innovation. So there's an urgent need for innovations in education. Why? Because in our relationship with learners and young people, we are not dealing with mechanical devices that can be quickly repaired, but we are dealing with living beings who are impressionable, they are volatile, they are sensitive, afraid, they are affectionate. And as such, to deal with them, we need to have a great understanding. We need the strength of patience. We need the strength of love. And as faculty members, as teachers, as mentors, we need to innovate in a certain way in order to ensure that learners become creative and they develop the much required competencies to move our organizations and societies forward. And this requires us to relook at our teaching conceptions and also our learning and assessment methodologies. And the teaching conceptions look at the knowledge delivery, our approaches to knowledge delivery, to exam preparation, ability development, attitude development, and conduct guidance. And we need to get into conversations to discuss these particular teaching conceptions and what are some of the fundamental innovations that faculty members, teachers, and mentors need to engage in order to make teaching and assessment instruments of help. And it is against that understanding that when we innovate along these teaching conceptions, we will be able to complement more effectively the tech innovations that we are introducing, or the learning spaces that we are designing in our academic institutions. And also, the teaching conceptions need to be supported with certain innovations in assessment. And appropriate learning assessment practices have been identified as one of the critical elements to maximize student learning. So higher education institutions should enhance pedagogical innovation, scientific and methodological innovation, and education and technological innovation. And the issues of education and technological innovation is much talked about, but some of the fundamental innovations in terms of our conception, in terms of aligning to the characteristics of learners, need more emphasis in our academic institutions today. And there are 5 dimensions on which teachers or faculty members can construct teaching conceptions. Number 1 is the essence of learning and teaching. There is need for radical shifts in our understanding of the essence of learning, the essence of teaching, the essence of assessment. And this comes with the whole issue of scholarship of teaching and learning. And we need to revisit, we need to re-examine our understanding of teaching and learning. We also need to relook at the roles of students and the roles of teachers. And there are certain innovations that come with understanding these particular roles of students and teachers and aligning that to our designs of the learning spaces. There are also innovations that should come through the dimension of expected learning outcomes. This requires significant innovations, which is not supported rather by the technology-driven innovations. There is also the dimension of content of teaching. What is the type of content that we are using in our classrooms, and also the issue of preferred styles and approaches rather to teaching. So these conceptions, these dimensions are instrumental in constructing teaching conceptions. And when we now have a teaching conception, there is need for innovations that are context specific or context dependent in order to ensure that teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help. So through inquiry-based practices, we tend to then look at the theoretical content, the thinking skills, and the process skills that we need learners to develop. And inquiry-based practice involves such practices as asking questions, defining problems, developing and using certain models in the classrooms, analyzing and interpretation of certain contexts or case studies, constructing explanations, designing solutions, and engaging in argument from evidence. And this requires embracing holistic assessment and also the issue of appreciative inquiry in order to ensure that teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help. So the issue of appreciative inquiry is also essential in us rethinking our approaches to teaching and assessment and trying to find ways to innovate in ways that will develop learners. Why? Because teaching and assessment should not be treated as separate moments, but they should be considered as simultaneous and must stimulate an inquiring, analytical, and creative approach, encouraging independent judgment and critical self-awareness among learners. So we need to look at the appreciative inquiry principles and innovate the way we do teaching and the way we do assessment in the classrooms. And we can get into more conversations regarding this particular issue. And there are different transformations that are there in education, and these transformations include nature of teaching, staff and professions. We also need to continually innovate along this area. Nature of administrative support, nature of teaching curriculum. I spoke about the 7 R's of curriculum in the previous code webinar, and also the nature of the classroom, which is the design of learning spaces. And there's also the issue of the character of the learning experience, which looks at the design of the learning spaces and also the manner in which the classes themselves are conducted. So these are some of the transformations that we see in education, and along these transformations, educational institutions need to innovate fundamentally in order to ensure teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help. So higher education should facilitate personal liberation and multiple perspectives among learners. And there is need for innovation. What should we do as faculty members or as an academic institution to facilitate personal liberation and multiple perspectives among learners? There is need to ensure data-driven teaching and assessment and openness to new learning and new learning experiences. Teaching and learning, or teaching and assessment, should ensure collaborative knowledge creation and learning beyond conventional notions of time and space. And this is where the tech-based innovations will also be essential in supporting. And the issue of a curriculum, there is need to innovate in ensuring that we have a rigorous, a real, and a curriculum that requires independence, a curriculum that is rich in thinking, revealing, rewarding, and reflective. Educators need to adopt interactive and activity-based learning and radically shift from theory to practice towards practice to theory. And also educators should be mentors, mediators, and coaches, and they need to ensure classrooms that goes beyond walls. So there are fundamental transformations that are required in innovations, and these transformations facilitate multiple classrooms, same lessons, and multiple perspectives in the classroom. And also we need the classroom that brings about real-world applicability to abstract learning concepts, and classrooms that become the medium to spark greater inquiry. And this is why we, as the Center for Organization, Leadership and Development, we are advocating for inquiry-based teaching and assessment. We are advocating for the incorporation of organization development interventions into our teaching and assessment practices. Why? Because we need to spark greater inquiry among learners, and we need to help learners bring about real-world applicability to abstract learning concepts. So as I learned, we need to make teaching and assessment instruments of help, And how do we do that? As we innovate certain approaches, number one, we need to decelerate the pace of the classroom and support learners. So faculty members or teachers, mentors, coaches, they need to decelerate the pace of the classroom and support learners. Number two, we need to engage in appreciative inquiry in order to identify those learning ideas that interest learners and are premised on a strength-based system. Number three, facilitate continuing professional learning among faculty members in order to shift, enhance, and sustain the faculty members' theoretical perspectives. Four, we need to shake proclivity or the tendency towards traditional classroom practices. And we are not going to abolish those practices, but we need to integrate, we need to enrich those practices in the context of what we need the learners to achieve. Five, we need to adopt and adhere to the dialectical learning model where we see learners, teachers, administrators as a learning community and everybody engaged in the development of the learner. We also need to facilitate contextual intelligence across all subjects and the integration of classrooms. Rather than having different faculty members teaching in different dimensions, there should be a way to integrate the different units or different modules from different teachers, thereby enhancing contextual intelligence and helping learners to see the relationship around the different modules or units that they are taking. We need also to promote the broader roles and responsibilities of educators. And I developed the 5 A's framework, which speaks about the educators being authors, advocates, agents, arbiters, and ambassadors of promoting right education. And in this context of ensuring that teaching and assessment do become instruments of help. We also need to stretch learning orthodoxy beyond the mere cultivation of capacity and efficiency and mere certification of learners, giving out certificates without learners having developed in terms of what they are learning. And this requires that as academic institutions or learning organizations, we foster inquiry-based learning practices. And I close through this slide, which says inquiry-based pedagogy will ensure teaching and assessment becomes instruments of help, thereby enhancing the quality of higher education. Inquiry-based pedagogy helps in preparing workforce that is adaptable, can solve abstract problems, operate with greater autonomy, and generate creative ideas. Inquiry-based pedagogy facilitates the achievement of the broader purposes of education, as pitly summarized in the following quote, and I read, universities do operate on a complex set of mutually sustaining fronts. They research into the most theoretical and intractable uncertainties of knowledge, and yet also they seek the practical application of discovery. They test, reinvigorate, and carry forward the inherited knowledge of earlier generations. They seek to establish sound principles of reasoning and action, which they teach to generations of students. Thus, universities operate on both the short and the long horizon. On the other hand, they work with contemporary problems and they render appropriate the discoveries and understanding that they generate. On the other hand, they forage in realms of abstraction and domains of inquiry that may not appear immediately relevant to others, but have the proven potential to yield great future benefits. So when we look at universities, when we look at higher education, in the context of scholarship, borrowing from Boyard 1990 and Schumann 1987, we need to revisit scholarship and we need to integrate that with the way we do teaching and assessment. As universities, we need to foster reliable or effective scholarship of discovery. We need to foster scholarship of application. We need to foster scholarship of integration. We need to revisit the scholarship of teaching. And we need to integrate that with the scholarship of practice and ensure that our teaching and assessment practices help learners develop and develop in total. We need to see learners graduating as integrated human beings. We need to see learners graduating with new values rather than the mere churning out of graduates who are adding no value to the marketplace. As universities, we need to revisit our branding and realize that the learners that we produce, the certificates that we issue, speak volume about our standards of teaching and assessment. Hence, there is need for innovation in teaching. There is need for innovation in assessment. And this can happen at faculty level. It also needs to happen at institutional level. So those who are involved in educational leadership need to reconsider. They need to rethink the teaching and assessment practices. There are numerous universities that are putting much effort in enhancing scholarship, but it's worrisome that there are some universities, there are some higher educational institutions that are in the business of academic instrumentalism, churning out graduates, giving out certificates, with learners having no understanding of what they learned. Yes, they can memorize concepts. Yes, they can recite certain concepts and theories, but they are not able to apply what they have learned. So there is need to revisit our functions of higher education and ensure that our approaches to teaching, our approaches to assessment are targeted at developing learners, learners who will add value to the marketplace, learners who are adaptable, learners who can solve abstract problems, operate with greater autonomy, generate creative ideas, and as such, move our societies forward. So this was our webinar for this month of March, and we're going to have another webinar towards the end of this month. And look out to our next webinar, and we'll be glad to get into conversations regarding this particular webinar on innovations in education towards inquiry-based teaching and assessment practices. As I have highlighted earlier on, the Center for Organization Leadership and Development strongly believes in dialogic conversations, and we more than welcome your comments, your suggestions for improvement as we are building up our efforts to ignite insightful conversations that are embedded in the field of organization development. Please follow us and do register if you are in Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, that is in South Africa, or if you are in Botswana. Please take note of the dates on this flyer, as I will be discussing the issues of organization leadership and development through our professional certification masterclass that is being arranged by the Business Growth Incubation Center in South Africa. Feel free to contact them on the numbers on the flyer, or you can drop them an email at info@bgic.co.za. You can also become a member of the Organization Leadership and Development Network Zimbabwe, or the Chartered Institute of Leadership and Governance Zimbabwe. Visit our website at www.centerall.com, and you will see the details of our membership. And we also do publish the Organization Leadership and Development Quarterly, which has an editorial mission to share and ignite insightful conversations that enhance knowledge, skills, and application, and strengthen synergies among organization development professionals and organizations. And please feel free to contact me on the email shown on the screen if you would want to be part of our mission in terms of the organization leadership and development quarterly, or sharing your insights through our webinar, the code webinar. And I take this time to thank you so much for listening to this particular webinar, and we hope to get into more conversations and more engagements in these particular discussions as we seek to enhance and advance the field of organization leadership and development. So it is equally important that we relay the message for the need to innovate in education and ensure that academic institutions, particularly those at higher education, do foster the development of integrated learners and also the creation of new values through going back to the basics of scholarship and being guided by the ethos of scholarship. Thank you so much for listening to this webinar session. See you again in our next webinar. Thank you.